This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But, most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 80 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. This is the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, December 7th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, we cover the major sprouts of Mormonism which sprang from the fertile religious Nauvoo soil. From the Strangites to Whiteites to Josephites to Brighamites to Godbeites and then back to the Brighamites again, every major faction of Mormonism seems to have a highly polarized stance on polygamy. Politics plays its role as laws are passed in attempt to outlaw the twins of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy, largely aimed at curtailing the religious overreach of the Mormon theocracy in Utah. This is part 3 in a multi-part series on the history of polygamy. We are continuing our slow meander through Mormon polygamy, a topic which dozens of historians have solely dedicated their lives to studying. As we examine Mormon polygamy, we can really only hit on the high points on these episodes, as we rip through more than a century and a half of history spanning thousands of miles and tens of thousands of people. We'll leave it to the regular historical timeline to dive much deeper into the high points we're hitting on in these episodes and talk about the people who lived through these versions of Mormonism. For part 3 of our discussion on Mormon polygamy, we're going to focus particularly on the history of polygamy in Utah during the Brighamite era and other competing factions in other locations leading up to the first manifesto in 1890. We won't be spending all of our time on the Brighamites, but they were particularly prominent in the public eye when it came to laws regarding polygamy, so much of our conversation will focus on Utah polygamy through the rest of the 1800s. So let's begin there with Brigham Young. After Joseph and Hyrum Smith's deaths in June of 1844, a bitter succession crisis gripped the Mormons. James Sprang emerged with a prophetic claim to the throne and would eventually take nearly half of the Mormons with him to Beaver Island and other locations outside of Nauvoo. A small contingency of Mormons remained in Illinois, eagerly awaiting the maturation of Joseph Smith's son, Joseph III, who would inherit the familial prophetic mantle. The other half of the unclaimed Mormon population largely followed the Quorum of the 12, headed by Brigham Young, who assumed the office of president over the Brighamite Mormons, and subsequently brought them out to the Great Basin of Utah, and settled massive swaths of land inhabited only by First Nationers prior to them. One of the primary points of contention between these competing factions of Mormonism was the argument over polygamy. Mother Emma and the majority of the Mormons remaining in Illinois were viciously opposed to polygamy, and most of the scholarship dedicated to proving that Joseph never practiced polygamy has come from the reorganized LDS Church. To this day, the reorganized church, which has become the Community of Christ, has never espoused Joseph's revelation on polygamy included in the Brighamite Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. Immediately after Joseph's death, the uncertainty accompanying the succession crisis was felt by every single Mormon. Was it best to follow the great orator, Sidney Rigdon, who had recently made a resurgence into the elite with Joseph's selection of him as his vice presidential candidate? Rigdon was Joseph's second in command through most of his charismatic years in Kirtland, and Rigdon hated polygamy. but he wasn't garnering as much support as the Quorum of the 12. Was it best to go with the majority of the witnesses to the gold plates, who went and followed James Strang along with the final remaining Smith brother, William? I mean, they were also opposed to polygamy, but the only thing designating James Strang as Joseph's rightful successor was a spurious letter that he claimed to have. Strang was still new to the Mormon movement. He hadn't suffered through everything the rest of the Mormons had. Did he really understand the overarching plight of the average Mormon? What about following the Quorum of the 12? Was that the best option? Many of them were practicing polygamy, and Joseph had dictated in a revelation during the organization of the Quorum in 1835 that they hold the keys to the priesthood in the event that the presidency is unable to perform their duties. Was Brigham Young really prophetically inclined enough to be the next charismatic leader of a visionary movement, or was he better as just a businessman? These were the choices every Mormon faced in the years following the death of the prophet and the patriarch of the church. No pressure, right? It was just their eternal salvation held in the balance pending their choice. Each one claimed to be the one true church. How do you know which one is correct? Each faction which broke from Nauvoo considered different men to be divinely inspired and the rightful heir to the charismatic throne left vacant by Joseph Smith. Each faction had their own justifications for why they were the one true religion, while all the other sects of Mormonism were infidels. To talk about so many factions of Mormonism, let's craft a functional analogy for today's episode. Picture, if you will, a small chunk of trees in a small colony in the forest like the quaking aspens near Fish Lake in Utah. Every tree in this colony shares the same root system and comes from the same soil. When one tree dies in the colony, the root system cuts it off and sprouts up replacement clones in their spot. Anytime forest fires encroach on this colony, it just seems pleased about it, as the fires merely clear the ground of pesky vegetation trying to steal the nutrients from this tree colony, so it's able to expand in the wake of a fire. Some of these clones combine into other trees, and others are just insufficiently large or they become diseased and the root system kills them off so it can feed the nutrients to other trees. Each tree in this colony has the same genetic code, all being clones sprouting off of the same root system, but each of them is slightly different. Their eyes are in different places. Their bark looks different from tree to tree. No two trees have the same exact branching pattern. Some are large and stout. Others can barely obtain enough nutrients to grow larger than just a small twig sprout. All of them have the same genetic code and come from the same soil. So an outsider would be at pains to distinguish one tree from another, but every tree is unique in some way. The Mormon movement in Nauvoo prior to the death of the prophet cultivated the perfect soil and root system for dozens of religious factions to sprout, which all shared the same Mormon memes. Not genes, but memes. Every one of the hundreds of Mormonisms which exist today all share this common Nauvoo root system. We're going to track a few of the major sprouts as they progress through their life cycles, and we'll be focusing on the mimetic markers of polygamy, and how its practice played out in each differing iteration of Mormonism. We'll begin with the Strangites. The first mimetic sprout we're going to discuss was the most prominent and largest sprout coming out of Nauvoo. About 12,000 Mormons ended up following a man named James Strang, many of whom were opposed to Brigham Young's practice of polygamy. Strang was publicly opposed to polygamy in Nauvoo when he was a member. This put him in the running as a very appealing charismatic successor to those who didn't believe Joseph Smith ever practiced polygamy. Soon after James Strang established his headquarters on Beaver Island in 1848, he succumbed to the counsel of the recently excommunicated John C. Bennett, as well as other polygamy advocates, and he made an abrupt shift from publicly decrying polygamy to secretly practicing it. His first wife, Mary Pierce, left Strang after he took a second wife named Elvira Eliza Field, after which he subsequently married 3 more women. Those who had joined Strang for his opposition to polygamy were quickly disenchanted. and the membership numbers of the Strangite Mormon sprout dwindled for the next half-decade until Strang's public assassination in June of 1856, almost 12 years to the day after the Smiths were assassinated in Carthage. Eventually, the Strang movement would largely be absorbed by the reorganization under Joseph Smith III, but a few hundred people would remain loyal to Strang and continue to adhere to his teachings under the banner of Strangite Mormonism. There are still a few Strangite families to this day. When we get into 1844, James Strang will appear in our historical timeline and will continue to follow the progression of the Strangites from there. For our purposes, we just need to bear in mind that polygamy was a hotly disputed issue, which divided more than just the Brighamite and RLDS sprouts. Polygamy was a topic which sowed divisions within numerous Mormon sects, Strangite included, especially with the public shift from anti-polygamy to practicing polygamy. Next, let's discuss the Whiteites, a very small and geographically isolated sprout of Mormonism cropped up under Lyman White's supervision. Lyman White was a die-hard faithful follower of Joseph Smith. He'd been designated a general of the Army of Israel during the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, and he took the office of apostle in place of Captain Fear Not, David W. Patton, after his death in the Battle of the Crooked River. Prior to Joseph's death, in a meeting of the Council of 50, Joseph issued a directive to Lyman White to find a place of refuge for the saints in the territory of Texas. After Joseph's death, Lyman White and Brigham Young didn't necessarily see eye to eye in some ways, and they had a falling out, resulting in Lyman White's excommunication in 1848. Lyman White's sprout of Mormonism came to be known colloquially as the Whiteites, and they built the first temple to be constructed post-Nauvoo, and that was in a location called Zodiac, Texas, where they practiced sealings, ordinations, washings and anointings, and celestial adoptions. The Whiteites also practiced polygamy, and Lyman White himself had 3 wives, Jane Margaret Ballantyne, Mary Howley, and Marianne Hobart. For a very brief time, the last remaining living Smith brother, William, led the Whiteites in Texas, and Lyman served as his counselor. After Lyman White's death, the Whiteites were largely absorbed by the reorganization led by Joseph's son, Joseph III. So let's talk about the Cutlerites now. Another small sprout to discuss is this Cutlerite movement. Alpheus Cutler had joined the church in 1833, and he stayed with Joseph Smith through thick and thin. In Nauvoo, Alpheus Cutler was inducted into the High Council, the Quorum of the Anointed, the Council of the 50, and he was the 6th person ever to receive his second anointing, which he was able to obtain a week before even Brigham Young received his second anointing. LDS records indicate that Cutler took Luna Rockwell, Margaret Carr, Abigail Carr, Sally Cox, Dizzy McCall, and Henrietta Miller as wives, sealed to him in 1846. Cutler went on to establish winter quarters in Nebraska, and winter quarters served as the landing pad for the Brighamite Mormons before they began their trek across the plains to Utah. Cutler and Brigham had a falling out, kind of like Lyman White and Brigham did as well, and Cutler subsequently formed his own Cutlerite church in Manti, Fremont County, Iowa. 2 of Alpheus Cutler's daughters ended up marrying Heber C. Kimball, but they were abandoned, as Kimball was notoriously negligent with most of his wives. In response to this, Cutler decided that polygamy wasn't a divine command, and he cut ties with his multiple wives and remained with his original wife, Lois, until his death in 1864. The Cutlerite sprout of Mormonism remains a church today with around a dozen adherents. The consensus among them is largely that Alpheus Cutler and Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy, and that it was merely a later fabrication by Brigham Young. After Cutler's death, the Cutlerites followed a revelation that they would build the temple that Joseph Sidney Rigdon had dedicated in Jackson County, Missouri, and at that point, they migrated the Cutlerite headquarters to Independence, Missouri. This happened while the reorganization was in process, and the vast majority of the Cutlerites fell away during the migration in order to follow Joseph Smith III into the reorganization of the LDS Church. This sprout spawned another breakoff faction, which died, and the mainstream Cutlerite sect was essentially snuffed out by the larger RLDS Church, and only survives as a withered twig sticking out of the Mormon heritage soil, led today by a man named Vernon Whiting, or Whiting, I'm not sure. So the Cutlerites, the Whiteites, and the Strangites, those comprised most of the major sprouts that descended from Joseph's Mormonism in Nauvoo. There are dozens of other sprouts that came out of the Nauvoo religious soil that we could discuss, but we'll forego doing so at this time in lieu of discussing the two largest branches which still exist today, the Utah-based Brighamite LDS Church and the Josephite Community of Christ, formerly known as the RLDS, the Reorganized Latter-day Saints. Let's begin this part of the conversation with the public perception of polygamy in Nauvoo prior to the departure of the Brighamite Mormons beginning in 1846. With how publicly it's understood that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy today, that's only come after a century of scholarship on his life. He was able to keep free love and polygamy so deep underground in Nauvoo that there were people inside the trusted elite who thought that Joseph Smith was not practicing polygamy, or that he was even opposed to it and defended his name in claiming that he opposed polygamy. Joseph's polygamy was so tightly under wraps that his own son, Joseph III, didn't know that his dad was a polygamist, even when some of Joseph's wives were living in the same house as the young Smith boy. Brigham continued practicing polygamy with an air of secrecy until he was certain the saints wouldn't be bothered while they were in Utah. After Joseph's death, Brigham and Heber C. Kimball took most of Joseph's wives for themselves, adding to their already sizable harem, but that was of course keeping in line with the biblical Levitical law of passing wives to brothers, albeit brothers in the covenant. Finally, in 1852, that's when Brigham went full force into public practice and widely published in Utah periodicals the 1843 revelation from Joseph Smith declaring polygamy to be a necessity for anyone to attain the Mormon celestial heaven. From 1852 to the end of the 1800s, the Mormon elite no longer were forced to keep polygamy a secret, and it was widely publicized that the Mormons were practicing polygamy in their Utah stronghold. However, Brigham Young openly announcing that polygamy was to be practiced openly merely confirmed what most of the country knew about Mormons already. This was published in the Vicksburg Daily Whig, 1st of January 1852. Quote, "You will not think me gifted with ubiquity when I tell you that 40 days since I was in the city of Salt Lake. As you have probably learned by the papers, the Mormon leaders and people instigated by them became so violent in denunciation of the United States government and its officers, and so determined in resistance of the law, that a longer stay among these fanatical wretches was thought incompatible with the dignity of government agents or the self-respect of loyal citizens of the United States. Socially and morally, the Mormons are the most degraded people on earth. Polygamy, adultery, incest, and other crimes of equal infamy are practiced openly and avowed. Murder stalks abroad. Treason and sedition are rife among the ci devant, the Latter-day Saints. The valley of the Salt Lake is a nest in which immorality, ignorance, and fanaticism have so long incubated that treason is already half-fledged. This organization of villains and fools is already formidable in number and spirit. Our government must look to it, else much trouble may result." End quote. We could literally spend this entire episode reading newspaper articles just like this, especially as the timeline progresses closer to the Civil War, which would eventually occupy people's minds much more than the degraded Mormons in Utah. But you get the idea from this single article. Most media outlets nationwide weren't friendly to the Mormons in Salt Lake Valley, and many other sprouts wholly unaffiliated with Brighamite Mormons were condemned for wearing the same Mormon badge. With wide public circulation of tabloids just like this, the broader public who'd thought the Mormon problem was dealt with when they were, kicked out of Illinois, they began to take notice and incite legal actions against Utah Mormons and their repugnant free love practices. One of the primary platforms of the 1856 presidential election was outlawing the twins of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy, and both of those were legal in the Utah Territory. With bipartisan support of that platform, James Buchanan won the presidency in 1856 as a Democrat. Buchanan would spearhead the political and military opposition to Mormon polygamy and slavery, sending American troops to Utah in 1857-58 to instate their own governor over Utah in place of Brigham, who had just finished his term as governor over the territory. Brigham Young answered Buchanan's military force by fortifying Parley's Canyon and setting up the Nauvoo Legion in preparation for the impending military conflict. The Mormon troops basically guerrilla terrorized the U.S. Army, and the Army eventually gave up and returned to the east. The Mormon War of 1857-58 came to be known as Buchanan's Blunder by the media. However, there were civilian casualties due to the heightened tensions between Brigham's theocracy and the U.S. government, like the Baker-Fancher Party. Thought by Brigham and other Mormon elites to be U.S. government spies, the Baker-Fancher Party became the victims of the Mountain Meadows Massacre in September of 1857 in the heat of this conflict. Another person who took notice of the Mormons and all of the political upheaval that they were causing was a man named Justin Smith Morrill. Justin Morrill was born in Vermont in 1810, not far from the Smith family, where he gained a significant education. After a few successful business ventures, Justin Morrill had enough money to retire from the mercantile industry and began his political career in the Whig Party in 1854. He was one of the founders of the Republican Party and ran on that platform as the Whig Party was slowly dissolving in American politics. At the beginning of the Civil War, Morrill still had his sights on the Mormons and was able to pass what was known as the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862. The subtitle of the act is as follows, quote, "An act to punish and prevent the practice of polygamy in the territories of the United States and other places, and disapproving and annulling certain acts of the Legislative Assembly of the Territory of Utah." End quote. One of the primary reasons Brigham had chosen Utah was the fact that it was a territory full of Native Americans that no European settlers had ventured to colonize. Most European colonialists merely passed through Utah on their way to California, which gained statehood back in 1850. But the Badlands of Utah were wholly undesirable to most frontier settlers, and the Mormons didn't fall under the jurisdiction of many U.S. federal laws, being simply a territory, and any efforts to enforce the laws were met with apathy at best and military resistance at worst. Brigham Young may have had some fantastical idea that if the Mormons established themselves with their own laws in the Utah territory, they would either not be bothered by the U.S. government, or they could start their own Mormon country out there and eventually establish a legally recognized theocracy, declaring independence from the federal United States, and they just wouldn't even have to deal with the laws established by the U.S. government. You know, Brigham was in this for the long haul. He had a multi-decade-long plan in place. So let's put the Utah sprout of Mormonism on hold for just a minute. We'll get back to discussing it and all of the branches coming off of it. But let's head back to Illinois. Let's examine how well the dozens of sprouts were growing as Joseph Smith III was maturing into young adulthood. When Joseph Smith was assassinated in 1844, Joseph III was a mere 11 years old. Hardly a practical candidate to take the throne, even though he'd been ordained and blessed as the rightful successor by his father, likely in January of 1844. James Strang, who had taken nearly half of the Mormons under his wing, had begun practicing polygamy in the early 1850s, and he had left some indications that Strang believed Joseph III would be the rightful successor to lead the Mormons. This was a belief many of the Strangites held, priming the movement to be reorganized with over 10,000 Mormons vacillating on who was the right prophet to follow. Emma Hale Smith married Major Louis Bideman, and they had spent years sorting out the financial affairs of Nauvoo throughout the early to mid-1850s, while Joseph III was maturing into early adulthood. Once James Strang was assassinated in 1856, it left thousands of Mormons without a rightful successor, as Strang had also failed to name a rightful heir to the throne that he had constructed out on Beaver Island. Joseph III was the only logical heir to take the Mormon throne that his father had originally established from 1830 to 1844. Joseph III stepped up to the plate in April of 1860 and finally assumed his status at the head of the Mormon aristocracy, harvesting dozens of disparate sprouts of Mormonism and annexing them into the reorganized Church of the Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the RLDS, not to be confused with the FLDS, which didn't exist yet. Beginning in January 1860, the soon-to-be designated RLDS Church published the True Latter-day Saints Herald. That's their own proprietary publication, and that's still published to this day. A small extract from the foreword discusses the purposes behind beginning the periodical. Quote, "That a church paper is very much needed, it requires no argument to prove. We want it, that through it, the great work of these latter days may be presented to the world of mankind in its true light, that the saints who are in transgression may be shown their sins, and likewise their duty to God, that those who are deceived by false teachers and have given heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils may be redeemed from their errors and taught the way of everlasting life." End quote. The editors were three men who were considered trusted individuals of Joseph Smith's elite, who were also viciously opposed to polygamy and remained in Illinois after the Brighamites and the Strangites abandoned. The very first article after the foreword of the article dealt with polygamy, and it reads as such, titled "Polygamy Contrary to the Revelations of God," kind of priming the reader. Quote, "A more delusive idea never entered into the heart of man than the belief that polygamy is one of the doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is a favorite doctrine of the Salt Lake Church because that church has turned the grace of God into lasciviousness and plunged themselves into this iniquity in direct opposition to the plain and positive commandments of the Lord our God, as they are recorded in the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, and in the Old and New Testament." End quote. Anti-polygamy was a central focus of the RLDS Church. It's worth noting that this publication was created in the wake of the Utah War of 1857 to 1858, when the RLDS factions were doing everything possible to divorce themselves from the Brighamite Church so the government and public wouldn't loop them all together as the same religion, regardless of the fact that they shared the same roots. Polygamy was under harsh scrutiny as Joseph III was coming of age to form the reorganization as their new prophet, and the other factions of Mormonism were sick and tired of being looped in with those fanatics out in Utah. Finally, in May of 1860, the True Latter-day Saints Herald published their announcement of Joseph III's rising to the mantle of prophet on April 6, 1860. The excitement in their tone is palpable. Quote, "We devote considerable space to the proceedings of this body, believing that they are of great importance to us, even as a nation. There is a great body of these people scattered throughout the states, who, unwilling to follow the fortunes and doctrines of Brigham Young, have been quietly waiting for the time to come when they could organize under a lineal descendant of Joseph Smith as their prophet. That time has at length arrived. Joseph Smith Jr. occupies the position which his father once held. A new era in the history of Mormonism has dawned, an era which we hope will greatly improve the name of this despised people. Whatever ideas we may entertain in relation to the doctrines of the Mormons, we must look with approbation and satisfaction upon any movement on their part which looks toward a radical reformation in their practices as a people. For many years past, Brigham Young has been looked upon as the embodiment of Mormonism, and those professing to be Mormons have been regarded as no better than he. Henceforth, they, or at least one branch of them, are to be judged by a different standard. The eyes of the world will now be turned upon young Joseph. Hitherto this man has borne a good name. His talents are of no mean order, and it is earnestly to be hoped that he will use them for good and not a bad purpose." Now we finally begin Joseph III's inauguration speech as the prophet and president of the reorganized church. Quote, "It is claimed that the great body of the Mormon people are scattered through the several states, and that a prophet by lineage will call together the scattered fragments and unite them into a grand whole. I would say to you, brethren, as I hope you may be, and in faith I trust you are, as a people that God has promised his blessings upon, I came not here of myself, but by the influence of the Spirit. For some time past I have received manifestations pointing to the position which I am about to assume. I wish to say that I have come up here not to be dictated by any man or set of men. I have come in obedience to a power not my own, and shall be dictated by the power that sent me. God works by means best known to himself, and I feel that for some time past he has been pointing out a work for me to do. I have endeavored as far as possible to keep myself unbiased. I have never conversed with J.J. Strang, for in those days I was but a boy, and in fact am now but a boy. I have not acquired a sufficient knowledge of men to be capable of leading myself, setting aside the leading of others. There is but one principle taught by the elders of any faction of this people that I hold in utter abhorrence. This is the principle taught by Brigham Young and those believing in him. I have been told that my father taught such doctrines. I have never believed it, and never can believe it. If such things were done, then I believe they were never done by divine authority. I believe my father was a good man, and a good man never could have promulgated such doctrines. A gentleman from Utah informs me that a majority of Brigham Young's people were restive, not satisfied with their condition, but dared say nothing. That those who preached and those who practiced his teachings were, in reality, the old fogies of the institution, the younger taking a different view of the matters." End quote. And thus the divine Smith lineage was once again embodied in the son of Joseph the prophet, Joseph Smith III, and he was emplaced upon the vacant Mormon throne his father had left behind. The RLDS Church was officially declared and led by Joseph Smith III from this time forward, in fierce opposition to the Utah Brighamite Mormonism. As stated by Joseph III himself, he couldn't believe, nor never could believe, that his father practiced polygamy or promulgated the doctrine thereof. Joseph III subsequently went on multiple mission trips to the Western Mormons. He did this in a bid to gain followers who wanted to be led by the familial lineage of Joseph or who were dissatisfied with Brigham's rule for whatever reasons. Joseph was successful in garnering some followers from these trips, but what he gained of much greater value was knowledge. During most of these trips, Joseph III was attempting to get to the bottom of his father's polygamy. In multiple interviews and letter exchanges with prominent people in Joseph Smith's life, Joseph III came to understand the overwhelming evidence of his father's practice of polygamy. This truly is incredible to someone like yours truly. I mean, it's surprising to me. Joseph III had lived in the Nauvoo mansion with his mother and several of Joseph's plural wives during his childhood, and even he wasn't aware that these women were sister wives to his mother, Emma. If we hold any skepticism about how Joseph Smith was able to conceal his polygamy from so many people for so many years, whatever techniques Joseph Smith employed must have been incredibly effective because even his own son was unaware that polygamy was being practiced by his own father in his own home. Joseph Smith was surprisingly effective at living two completely different lives. Mormon historian Roger D. Launius does a great job of dealing with Joseph Smith III in his article titled Methods and Motives, Joseph Smith III's Opposition to Polygamy, 1860 to 1890. Here's just a few extracts discussing Joseph Smith III's war on the facts when it came to his father's polygamy. Quote, "When Joseph Smith III preached his sermon as leader of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at Amboy, Illinois on 6 April 1860, he expressed his unqualified aversion to the Mormon doctrine of plural marriage. No issue infuriated or drew his attention as did plural marriage, and especially charges of his father's role in its origination. Indeed, opposition to the practice became something of a cause célèbre for Smith and, by extension, for the Reorganized Church during the 19th century. Recent historical investigation has demonstrated that, by the last decade of the century, the Reorganized Church as an institution had rejected the previously well-accepted idea that Joseph Smith Jr. had begun the practice. During the 1970s and 1980s, however, numerous historians, among them Reorganized Church historian Richard P. Howard, probed deeper into the origins of plural marriage. demonstrating beyond reasonable doubt the Mormon prophet's central role in developing the doctrine during the Nauvoo experience and offering frameworks for understanding it. These compelling historical arguments raise a central question. How could Joseph Smith III flatly deny his father's role in beginning Mormon polygamy while confronted with substantial evidence to the contrary? Additionally, what role did Smith play in the anti-polygamy crusade of the later 19th century? These questions inform the analysis presented in this essay. Essentially, Joseph Smith III approached his father's involvement in plural marriage from an already fixed viewpoint. His admission that he could never believe his father might have been involved in polygamy seems to have guaranteed his perspective in spite of countervailing evidence. Smith subscribed to a postulate as immovable as a geometric theorem. Number 1, Joseph Smith Jr. had been a good man. Number 2, good men do not practice polygamy. Number 3, therefore, Joseph Smith Jr. could not have been involved in Mormon plural marriage. All his actions and thought processes concerning the practice rested upon this central postulate." End quote. The cognitive dissonance in Joseph Smith III's writings is painful. His crusade to prove that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy came into conflict with the facts surrounding his father. Joseph Smith III spoke with a number of Joseph's widows and closest acolytes who all affirmed that Joseph did indeed practice polygamy, but Joseph III wanted to exonerate his father's name and believe what his mother claimed to be true concerning this practice that he considered repugnant and immoral. Joseph III's writings from the late 1800s show that he was never able to reconcile that cognitive dissonance. Instead, he just compartmentalized the issue. From later in this same article from Lonnius about Joseph III, quote, "On 5th of March, 1886, he, Joseph Smith III, wrote to Zenas H. Gurley, Jr., an apostle who was a gadfly to Smith on the question of polygamy's origins as well as other issues." Now quoting the letter, quote, "You know that while I believe Father was not the author of Utah polygamy, I have not and am not now making the battle against the Utah Church on that ground, but upon the ground that plural marriage is not of God, no matter whoever the revelation so-called came through or who taught or practiced it." Back to Lonnius. Smith also suggested that his father had not been perfect, and that if it turned out he had been responsible for polygamy's establishment, he would be punished. He told a J.J. Barber of Darttown, Georgia, on 15th May 1878, now quoting Joseph III again, quote, "While I fully believe that Joseph did not receive the revelation referred to, yet if he did, it is so directly opposed to the laws already received that I must admit it to have been either of man or of the devil." End quote. So, really, Joseph III's opposition to Joseph Smith's polygamy would be enshrined in RLDS scholarship and historical studies for nearly 100 years before being acknowledged by some RLDS historians. Polygamy deniers only occupy a very small fringe group of Mormon historians, most of whom aren't taken very seriously among the mainstream Mormon historians. Joseph III would continue to fight against polygamy, falling largely in line with the U.S. government, who continued to apply legal restrictions against Utah polygamy throughout the remainder of the 1800s. The Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act had been put into place in 1862, lobbied by Justin Morrill and signed into law by Abraham Lincoln while the Civil War raged in its infancy. With the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act signed into law, a force came from within the Utah Territory in the form of a brand new sprout run by the man named William S. Godbeites. In the very late 1860s, Godbeites was opposed to the incredible amount of control Brigham had over the Utah Territory, and he became increasingly opposed to polygamy. He voiced his criticisms of Brigham Young in the Utah Magazine, which would eventually become the Salt Lake Tribune. And he was subsequently excommunicated from the Brighamite LDS Church in 1869. Here we see another small sprout crop up from the fertile Mormon soil called the Godbeites. Godbeites and the women who influenced him came up with an ingenious solution to the plight of women living under the patriarchal grip of polygamy. They finally had a solution to end the oppressive patriarchy in Utah. They decided to give women the right to vote. The reason that I'm focusing on William Godbey in this little bit, as opposed to the women who lobbied with him, is because the government was exclusively run and moved by men. Women who wanted their voices to be heard in the realm of politics could merely exert their desires on the men who were in office, but women didn't actually have their own voice prior to this. And I don't want to say that as any kind of excuse. We'll be focusing on the prominent women involved in politics, using men as proxies as our historical timeline progresses. For now, we just have to focus on the primary movers here. In 1870, Utah women were finally given the right to vote with the hopes that they would vote to outlaw polygamy. When the tally was taken, they overwhelmingly voted to retain the right to continue practicing polygamy, even though it violated the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, which had been passed 8 years prior to this. Women's right to vote in Utah was eventually revoked by Congress in 1887, with the Edmunds-Tucker Act, when they realized that the Mormon women wouldn't vote in favor of abolishing polygamy. Now, I just have to take a step back for a second. Trying to unpack why the women voted to keep polygamy is far too complex an exercise for us to try and engage with today. We're just going to hold off on that. Back to it, it became clear that giving women the right to vote wouldn't remove polygamy, so the government went back to the drawing board. A law like the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act on the books is great, but it doesn't mean anything if that law can't be enforced upon the people the law attempts to control, which was the Moral Act's greatest flaw. Utah had been established as a theocracy by Brigham Young, and he didn't plan on ceding his stranglehold anytime soon. Every government office from the top down was run by Mormons, and they all looked to Brigham Young for guidance or permission to do anything. Nothing happened in Utah without Brigham's knowledge or consent. The Moral Anti-Bigamy Act specifically targeted the Mormons in Utah, but the government authorities there refused to enforce the law because they were all Mormons. A subsequent act was necessary to be able to enforce Moral's Anti-Bigamy Act. Another occurrence which happened in the meantime merely added fuel to the U.S. government's fire: the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It happened back in 1857, but still nobody had been punished for the deaths of 120 men, women, and children. The U.S. government had been a bit preoccupied since the massacre with the Civil War and the Reconstruction afterward, so it took a bit of time for them to react properly, while at the same time they were trying to figure out how to enforce anti-polygamy laws in the Utah theocracy. The government wanted Utah to be accountable for their actions. Finally, a congressman from Vermont named Luke P. Poland took a stand and proposed a bill known as the 1874 Poland Act. This is from an article on famoustrials.com about the Poland Act of 1874. Quote, "Each Utah county had a probate court presided over by an elected judge. No federal circuit court was ever established in Utah or with jurisdiction over Utah. Many litigants, especially Mormons, took their cases to the probate court rather than before the federally appointed judge in the district court. The effect was to displace the federally appointed courts with a system of local control. Congress reacted by placing the judiciary firmly under federal control. The Poland Act of 1874, 18 Statute 253, restricted the probate courts to matters of estates and guardianship, removing all civil, chancery, and criminal jurisdiction. It gave the district courts exclusive jurisdiction for all suits over $300, and it abolished the local offices of the territorial marshal and territorial attorney." End quote. That last line in the paragraph there is the most important when it came to enforcing laws in Utah. It abolished local offices of territorial marshal and territorial attorney. Those were offices held by people under Brigham's control, and they wouldn't do anything to offend the prophet and king of Utah. This removed executive and enforcement power from Utah's jurisdiction and made it a territory enforced by U.S. government marshal and attorneys. From this same article, quote, "Prosecution for the murders at Mountain Meadows became possible only when, in 1874, Congress passed the Poland Act. The act sought to eliminate the nearly total control the Mormon Church had over Utah's justice system. The Poland Act redefined the jurisdiction of Utah courts, restricting the formerly powerful probate courts, which had taken no action concerning the 1857 massacre, to their traditional jurisdiction. The act also eliminated the territorial marshal and attorney, giving their duties to a U.S. marshal and a U.S. attorney. Finally, the act opened up Utah juries to non-Mormons. The first grand jury called under the new law in September 1874 indicted Lee, Dame, Haight, Higbee, Klingensmith, Stewart, and 3 other men for the deaths of members of the Fancher Party at Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1857. End quote. So these 9 men were indicted for the Mountain Meadows Massacre under the very first non-Mormon, non-Utah jury, and John D. Lee was summarily executed in 1877 by firing squad for his involvement in the massacre. And John Lee was the only person who suffered any legal repercussions for the intentional deaths of 120 people. This Poland Act successfully removed prosecutorial discretion from the Utah Territory and made it an operation of the federal government. Suddenly, federal laws were much easier to enforce in the Utah Territory. Polygamy was now not only illegal, but enforceable by the U.S. government. This drove a number of polygamy practitioners underground or into satellite locations like Canada or Mexico. However, the passage of the Poland Act in conjunction with the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act didn't suddenly force the Utah Territory into like a progressive utopia or something and immediately remove the practice of polygamy. Polygamy was a divine tenet of Mormonism, and people were willing to go to extreme lengths to continue practicing it. Men moved their wives around to different locations, and they wouldn't be seen in public with any of their wives. Most of the documentation of these marriages was in church control. It's not like there were government-issued marriage licenses for these polygamous relationships, so even if someone like Heber Kimball was walking the streets with 7 of his wives, the U.S. government didn't have access to any documentation to prove that they were indeed his wives. How do you enforce a law when the people who would be prosecuted under it have no legal paper trail and they just disappear underground as soon as you try to enforce it? This was the constant interplay battle between the U.S. government and the Mormon elite throughout the last half of the 1800s. Mormons ran and oversaw everything that happened in the territory, and they didn't really appreciate the ever-growing power of the U.S. government absorbing their own power. James A. Garfield was notoriously opposed to polygamy. It was seen as the last surviving relic of the twins of barbarism. In Garfield's inaugural address, delivered the 4th of March 1881, we find this little gem. Quote, "The Constitution guarantees absolute religious freedom. Congress is prohibited from making any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The territories of the United States are subject to the direct legislative authority of Congress, and hence the general government is responsible for any violation of the Constitution in any of them. It is therefore a reproach to the government that in the most populous of the territories, the constitutional guarantee is not enjoyed by the people and the authority of Congress is set at naught. The Mormon Church not only offends the moral sense of manhood by sanctioning polygamy, but prevents the administration of justice through ordinary instrumentalities of law. In my judgment, it is the duty of Congress, while respecting to the uttermost the conscientious convictions and religious scruples of every citizen, to prohibit within its jurisdiction all criminal practices, especially of that class which destroy the family relations and endanger social order. Nor can any ecclesiastical organization be safely permitted to usurp in the smallest degree the functions and powers of the national government." End quote. Garfield really wanted to be able to enforce government laws on the Utah Territory and was opposed to the practice of polygamy, even though he was a champion of the free exercise of religion. Those two came in direct conflict. Garfield was subsequently assassinated by Charles Guiteau a mere 4 months into his presidency. Now, just to take a quick digression here, the widely accepted justification for this assassination was due to Guiteau's disappointment that Garfield wouldn't give him office of consulship at Paris, which he thought that Garfield owed to him due to his lobbying and campaigning efforts in favor of Garfield. I'll only add this into the mix. Guiteau was also a member of the Free Love Oneida group, and he wore the nickname Get Out because he was found to be repulsive by many of the women in the society. I honestly don't think that Garfield's hard stance against polygamy had anything to do with Guiteau assassinating him, Guiteau being the free love champion that he was, but it is one interesting detail to throw in the mix. Garfield's vice president, Chester A. Arthur, took the office of president after Garfield's belabored and gruesome death. Arthur wasn't as hardline against polygamy as his predecessor or his successor, Grover Cleveland. And for a very brief stint, while Arthur was in office, the Mormons could rest easy before things became really hard for them. However, the ever-growing anti-polygamy movement didn't need the president in order for it to proliferate. In 1882, another Vermont government official, this time a senator named George F. Edmunds, who would eventually deliver the fatal blow to polygamy, was able to pass the Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act of 1882. Where this act differed from the Morrill Act of 1862 was threefold. First, this Edmunds Act made it a felony at the federal level to practice polygamy. Second, it included cohabitation as a marker for determining polygamous relationships. Third, no man practicing polygamy could hold any public office in Utah. Now, if any man was seen entering a home where women were living who weren't his wife, not only could he not hold a government job, but he could be swept up in this draconian measure of anti-cohabitation. This forced then-Prophet John Taylor into hiding, as Brigham Young had passed away 5 years earlier in 1877. The Edmunds Act of 1882 only added more artillery to the arsenal of law enforcement against polygamy, and suddenly, Mormon polygamist men were arrested and imprisoned in droves. The arrest of polygamous men had a few devastating impacts, mostly on the families of the people left behind. One man supporting multiple families already stretches resources pretty thin, but you take him out of the equation and completely remove those resources, the resulting humanitarian crisis quickly became a PR nightmare for the U.S. government. The political climate surrounding polygamy and its abolition it was kind of in this weird limbo at this point in the late 1880s. The First Amendment was a solid argument that Mormons could make, as the anti-polygamy laws were directly crafted to infringe on their religious practices that the government didn't approve of. The way the government was able to get around this was by making the argument that people could believe in a religion that held polygamy as one of its tenets, but like slavery with the Old Testament, they couldn't legally practice the belief without infringing on the rights of other people. The laws were also crafted to punish those practicing polygamy instead of punishing the religion which taught polygamy. This was a bottom-up approach, but it left a lot of families without a provider. Whereas if they were to attack the religion itself with a top-down legal approach to eradicating polygamy, it may mitigate the damage done to already poverty-stricken families in Utah. In reaction to the public perception of the prosecution of polygamists, Grover Cleveland's annual address in December of 1885, in the first year of his first term as president, included a few excerpts about polygamy in Utah. Cleveland sought to address the difficulty in prosecuting polygamy when no legal or census records faithfully recorded polygamous marriages, but he also gave a little bit of a heart sell about the damage to the nuclear family that polygamy creates. From Cleveland's 1885 December speech, quote, "The Utah commissioners express the opinion, based upon such information as they are able to obtain, but that few polygamous marriages have taken place in the territory during the last year." He was excited that they were on the decline. They further report that while there cannot be found upon the registration lists of voters the name of a man actually guilty of polygamy, and while none of that class are holding office, yet at the last election in the territory, all the officers elected, except in one county, were men who, though not actually living in the practice of polygamy, subscribed to the doctrine of polygamous marriage as a divine revelation and a law unto all higher and more binding upon the conscience than any human law, local or national. Thus is the strange spectacle presented of a community protected by a republican form of government to which they owe allegiance, sustaining by their suffrages a principle and belief which set at naught the obligation of absolute obedience to the law of the land, which lies at the foundation of republican institutions. The strength, the perpetuity, and the destiny of the nation rest upon our homes, established by the law of God, guarded by parental care, regulated by parental authority, and sanctified by parental love. These are not the homes of polygamy. The mothers of our land, who rule the nation as they mold the characters and guide the actions of their sons, live according to God's holy ordinances, and each secure and happy in the exclusive love of the father of her children, sheds the warm light of true womanhood, unperverted and unpolluted, upon all within her pure and wholesome family circle. These are not the cheerless, crushed, and unwomanly mothers of polygamy. The fathers of our families are the best citizens of the Republic. Wife and children are the sources of patriotism, and conjugal and parental affection beget devotion to the country. The man who, undefiled with plural marriage, is surrounded in his single home with his wife and children, has a stake in the country which inspires him with respect for its laws and courage for its defense. These are not the fathers of polygamous families. There is no feature of this practice or the system which sanctions it which is not opposed to all that is of value in our institutions. There should be no relaxation in the firm but just execution of the law now in operation, and I should be glad to approve such further discreet legislation as will rid the country of this blot upon its fair fame. Since the people upholding polygamy in our territories are reinforced by immigration from other lands, I recommend that a law be passed to prevent the importation of Mormons into the country." End quote. With Cleveland so harshly against polygamy, new legislation could finally be approved which finally attacked polygamy from the top down instead of just punishing those who practice it. George Edmunds took this new possible approach into consideration to try and plug the holes left by his 1882 Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act. Edmunds and a Virginia congressman named John Randolph Tucker teamed up to write the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887, which directly targeted the Mormon religion and those who practice polygamy at a systematic level, and imposed the annexation of any church property over $50,000 to be absorbed as property of the government until the Mormons complied. It also disincorporated the Mormon Church as an entity and defunded the Perpetual Immigration Fund. The Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887 hit the Mormon Church where it hurt. The passage of this law coincided with the death of the third prophet, John Taylor. Taylor had fallen ill to congestive heart failure and was unable to execute his duties as prophet. The duties of prophet fell to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, with Wilford Woodruff as president until 1889, when he was finally called and sustained as the president of the church. This was a trying time for Mormons in Utah. Wilford Woodruff was particularly millennialist in his sermons, frequently preaching that the end is nigh at hand, and that people of this generation will see the second coming of Jesus. His apocalyptic revelations waxed in intensity as he progressed into his later life. Many Mormons saw the government's hard stance against polygamy as the final sign that the end times were actively happening. This lapse of 2 years from 1887 to 89, when Woodruff took the mantle as prophet, may be explained by the Mormons not concerning themselves with the government because they knew that Jesus was on his way any time now, and he would rule over the New Jerusalem that the Mormons had built in Utah, burning away all the sinners from the world. The Edmunds-Tucker Act would put the pressure on the Mormons to snap them into reality and force Wilford Woodruff's hand as acting president of the church. Now reading from the Wikipedia article about the Edmunds-Tucker Act. Quote, "The act disincorporated both the LDS Church and the Perpetual Immigration Fund on the grounds that they fostered polygamy. The act prohibited the practice of polygamy and punished it with a fine from $500 to $800 and imprisonment of up to 5 years. It dissolved the corporation of the church and directed the confiscation by federal government of all church properties valued over a limit of $50,000. The act was enforced by the U.S. Marshal and a host of deputies. The act, number 1, disincorporated the LDS Church and Perpetual Immigration Fund with assets to be used for public schools in the territory. 2, required an anti-polygamy oath for prospective voters, jurors, and public officials. 3, annulled territorial laws allowing illegitimate children to inherit. Number 4, required civil marriage licenses to aid in the prosecution of polygamy. Number 5, abrogated the common law spousal privilege for polygamists, thus requiring wives to testify against their husbands. Number 6, disenfranchised women who had been enfranchised by the territorial legislation in 1870. So they took away women's right to vote. Number 7, replaced local judges, including the previously powerful probate court judges, with federally appointed judges. And finally, number 8, abolished the office of territorial superintendent of district schools, granting the Supreme Court of the Territory of Utah the right to appoint a commissioner of schools. Also called for the prohibition of the use of sectarian books and for the collection of statistics of the number of so-called Gentiles and the Mormons attending and teaching in the schools. End quote. The passage of the Edmunds-Tucker Anti-Polygamy Act was challenged by the church because the government was absorbing church properties. And in 1890, a Supreme Court ruling titled Late Corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints v. United States held that the property seizures were lawful and not an infringement on the free exercise of religion. With no options left, and Jesus not miraculously appearing to defend polygamy, Wilford Woodruff, 1.5 years into his presidency, utterly defeated by the puritanical U.S. government, approached the October 1890 conference with the infamous manifesto in hand.
My fellow brothers and sisters, for some time now, we have been persecuted by the U.S. government for practicing the law of celestial marriage. It has forced us to do something we have not wanted to do for so long. To whom it may concern, press dispatches have been sent for political purposes from Salt Lake City, which have been widely published to the effect that the Utah Commission, in their recent report to the Secretary of the Interior, alleged that plural marriages have been contracted in Utah since last June, or during the past year. Also, that in public discourses, the leaders of the church have taught, encouraged, and urged the continuance of the practice of polygamy. I, therefore, as president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, do hereby, in the most solemn manner, declare that these charges are false. We are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice, and I deny that either 40 or any other number of plural marriages have during that period been solemnized in our temples or in any other place in the territory. One case has been reported in which the parties alleged that the marriage was performed in the Endowment House in Salt Lake City in the spring of 1889, but I have not been able to learn who performed the ceremony. Whatever was done in this matter was without my knowledge. In consequence of this alleged occurrence, the Endowment House was, by my instructions, taken down without delay. Inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages, which laws have been pronounced constitutional by the court of last resort, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws, to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside, to have them do likewise. There is nothing in my teachings to the church or in those of my associates during the time specified which can be reasonably construed to inculcate or encourage polygamy. And when any elder of the church has used language which appears to convey such teaching, he has been promptly reproved. And I now publicly declare that my advice to the Latter-day Saints is to refrain from contracting any marriage forbidden by the law of the land. Signed, Wilford Woodruff, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
And that's where we're going to leave things until next week. Of all the various iterations of Mormonism we've examined today, they all sprouted from this central point of fertile religious soil in Nauvoo, and they all have the same roots. Some of these sprouts hated polygamy and denied the founding prophet ever practiced it. Others held to the practice as the only way to achieve eternal salvation. One thing I personally gained from studying this so much for the past month or so is a major appreciation and sense of empathy for what these people went through. Each group of Mormons were only doing what they viewed as right in God's eyes, and that required them to live by the words of men who were invested mostly in their own self-interests. The government knew that polygamy was illegal, and their jurisdiction covered the Utah Territory, but they were only trying to perpetuate the status quo of puritanical monogamy. And there is nothing saying that is the perfect form of marriage or family structure. People went into hiding for years to protect what they considered moral. People went to prison for following God's will. Mormons killed and died for polygamy. The government killed and sustained losses to limit polygamy. The government directly violated the free exercise of religion to halt polygamy, and it wouldn't be until 1978 that the Edmunds-Tucker Act was repealed. The government annexed Mormon property to stop polygamy. The government forced already impoverished people into even deeper cycles of poverty amidst their war on polygamy. This isn't a simple comic book story with clear lines of good guys and bad guys. These were real people. These people were trying to do what they thought was right. The people at the highest levels in government and the Mormon Church suffered the least. Those who suffered the most were the small families, with very little power in the church to change their status. Those are the people who were arrested or exiled from Utah to seek a land of refuge which wouldn't infringe on their religious freedom. Nobody was right, and everybody was just a little bit wrong in different ways. Remember this whenever considering any issue. People know that they are on the right side. Everybody is the protagonist of their own story, and everybody's religion is the one true religion. All right, thank you so much for listening. Just have a couple of things to quickly take care of. Last week, that was December 3rd, Sunday, I participated in David Smalley's podcastathon, I don't know what he's calling it these days, and he raised a ton of money for Modest Needs organization and fulfilled a bunch of goals on it. During the Mormon Hour, I don't know who tuned in, who listened, but we hit the $500 match goal, and we raised over $1,000 during the Mormon Hour alone. And that, I mean, it was really, really remarkable to see the amount of support. So for those of you who may have tuned in or who donated, I just want to personally thank you so much for coming on and supporting during the Mormon Hour. And, it was a fascinating subject that we talked about. I brought some clips from Bednar as well as from Boyd K. Packer. And it was really fun to see David Smalley's reaction to these bigots, using their flowery language and couching their bigotry in long audio clips. But it was still really fun. And overall, the fundraising was a resounding success. They didn't quite make the goal that they had planned on making. Who knows exactly why that happened, but all in all, it was really successful. They were able to raise a lot of money. So thank you for tuning in. Thanks for supporting the Modest Needs Foundation. It was really awesome. So beyond that, I wanted to announce, last week I told everybody that we weren't doing our Name a Home evening on the regular first Monday of the month on the 4th, and we're moving it to the 11th. Yes, that is going to happen this upcoming Monday. If you are a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/NakedMormonism, you can check your inbox on the evening of Monday, the 11th of December, 2017. And we're going to have on Mark and Dan from the How to Heretic podcast to talk about their project that they've recently begun, as well as just, some Thank God I'm Atheist stuff. They're really cool guys. I consider them personal friends, and I'm stoked to have them on. So if you want to join in on that conversation or hear it after we have it, I'll be recording it, putting it up there for the patrons as a special bonus episode. So that's with that to look forward to. Next week, we're going to focus on the real people who suffered through polygamy, and that is the women. And I'm hoping to bring on an expert to help us navigate through the 20th century polygamy and give us some insight into the women's plight surrounding the practice of polygamy. So with that to look forward to, that's what we're going to do next week, and hopefully cover some of the polygamist sects spawning off of 1890 and the Manifesto. There's a lot more history to get into. This polygamy series might blow up to a few more episodes than I initially intended. I recorded an interview that ended up being well over an hour. I'm trying to decide how to break that up and put it in an episode. There's a lot going on behind the scenes here in constructing these polygamy episodes, but next week we're hoping to have that guest on, and I'm really looking forward to it. So with that out of the way, I don't think we have any new patrons to thank, so I do just want to thank all of the patrons at patreon.com/nakedmormonism for pledging to support this show monetarily and supporting this research. If you like what you hear and you want to see the show perpetuated into perpetuity, I guess that can be a phrase, why not? As well as you want to gain access to a bunch of exclusive content, sign up to pledge at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. We'd really love to have you on board in the discussion forums over there, as well as the extra episodes that you gain access to. So with that done, I hope you don't mind excusing me as I head to a local Verizon store to try and keep this podcast free. So before I head over there and do that, I need to thank the people who keep this running on the background. Thank you so much to Julie, our social media guru, for posting up on the Twitter and Facebook pages and keeping conversation going over there. Thank you, Julie. Thank you to Jason Camo. He made the music that you're listening to right now, used with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com to hear more of his music and download it from there. Thank you to Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres. He provides the legal counsel used in this show. Thank you so much, Andrew. And, of course, thank you so much to all of the wonderful listeners out there, once again, for lending me your ear. I hope to talk at you next time, here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.